Yes, yes,
yes. Dear Rector, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in 1860, on the verge of sailing through the Mediterranean to follow Garibaldi's expedition in Sicily, Alexandre Dumas stopped in Marseille and wanted to visit the Château d'If, where his hero, Edmond Dantes, before becoming the Count of Monte Cristo, spent 14 years of his life as a prisoner, obviously, and was visited and rescued in his cell by the abbot Faria. During his visit, Dumas discovered that the visitors were shown the real cell of Monte Cristo, and the guides were speaking of him, Faria, and other characters of the novel as if they had really existed. On the contrary, the same guides ignored that the Château d'If was imprisoned an historical figure like Mirabeau. And in the early 60s, me too, I visit the castle and I see the cell and the hole dug, excavated by the abbot Faria. So Dumas comments in his memories, it is the privilege of novelists to create characters who kill those of the historians. The reason is that historians only evoke mere ghosts, while novelists create persons in flesh and bones. Once a friend of mine urged me to organize a symposium on the following subject: why, since we know that Anna Karenina is a fictional character who doesn't exist in our real world, we weep for her deeds, or in any case we are deeply moved by her misfortunes. Probably many sophisticated readers will not cry on the fate of Scarlett O'Hara, but they too are certainly shocked by the fate of Anna Karenina. I resolutely told my friend that this phenomenon had neither ontological nor logical relevance and could only interest psychologists. Moreover, we certainly can identify ourselves with the case of fictional characters, but this doesn't occur only when reading fiction. Many of us have sometimes thought of the possible death of a beloved person and felt touched, if not moved to tears, even though we knew for sure that the imagined event was not the case. Later, I had to admit that there is a difference between to weep for the imagined death of our beloved and to weep for the death of Anna Karenina. In the first case, when after the daydream we are asked if our beloved had really passed away, we say that it wasn't true. As it happens when we suddenly awake from a nightmare and we realize with relief that it was only an hallucination. On the contrary, if we were asked if Anna Karenina died, we would always answer positively. And if the fact that Anna Karenina committed suicide were true in every possible world. Moreover, some people are pulled to suicide when abandoned by their beloved. But I have never heard of somebody who committed suicide because one of his friends had been abandoned by her beloved. It seems thus strange that when reading that Goethe's Werther killed himself because of his ill-fated love, many romantic youngsters did the same by a so-called Werther effect. Why? To commit suicide because somebody else has been abandoned by his or her beloved. It seems funny that we deeply share the sorrow of somebody else only or mainly when we know that he or she never exists. What does it mean that fictional characters do not have some kind of existence? According to Meinung, every representation of judgment has necessarily an object, even though this object is not necessarily an existing one. Centuries before Meinung, Avicenna said that the existence was only an accidental property of an essence or substance, accidens adveniens quiditati. In this sense, there can be abstract objects like the number 17 or the right angle, which do not properly exist, but, they say, subsist, and concrete objects like myself and Anna Karenina, with the slight difference that I am a physically existing object, while Anna is not. Now, I am not concerned today with an ontology of fictional characters. An object was, for Meinung, a mind-independent object. The right angle exists somewhere, even though all the members of our species disappeared. Since, on the contrary, the core of my reflections today is why people feel moved by fictional characters, I am obliged to consider Anna Karenina as a mind-dependent, not independent, but mind-dependent object, or the object of a cognition. In other terms, my approach is not an ontological, but a semiotic one. My concern is not in which sense the assertion Anna Karenina committed suicide is true or not, but rather why a normal reader can take as true the assertion Anna Karenina committed suicide, even when he or she knows that Anna Karenina is a narrative figment. By definition, fictional texts clearly speak of non-existing persons and events, and from the point of view of a truth-conditional semantics, a fictional assertion should always tell what is not the case. In spite of that, we do not take fictional assertions as lies. First of all, in reading a piece of fiction, we subscribe a silent agreement with its author, who pretends that something is true and asks us to pretend to take it seriously. Secondly, we know that every fiction designs a possible world, and all our judgments of truth or falsehood must concern that possible world. In this way, it is true that in the Conan Doyle's world, Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street, and it is false that he lived in Tartu. And we can bet our life on this point, or to have a duel in order to demonstrate that we are right. A fictional assertion like Anna Karenina commits suicide by throwing herself in the path of a train is as true as the historical assertion Adolf Hitler committed suicide and his corpse was burned in a bunker in Berlin. Our instinctive reaction would be that the assertion about Anna refers to an invention, while the one about Hitler concerns what was really the case. Thus, to be correct in terms of truth-conditional semantics, we should say that it is true that Anna Karenina committed suicide by throwing herself in the path of the train is only another way for saying it is true in this world than in a Tolstoy's novel it is written that Anna Karenina committed suicide by throwing herself and so on and so forth. So, if so, in logical terms, the truth about Anna Karenina would be through the dicto and not the re. And from a semiotic point of view, it would concern the plane of expression and not the plane of content, or in Saussurean terms, the level of the signifier and not that of the signified. We can make true statements about fictional characters because what happens to them is recorded in a text, And the text is like a musical score. It is true that Anna Karenina commits suicide by throwing herself in the path of the train, in the same way in which it is true that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is in C minor and not in F major like the Sixth, and begins with G, 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 E flat. However, such a position is not completely satisfying from the point of view of the experience of the reader. I've never seen somebody who wept because Tolstoy wrote that. I saw people that wept because Anna died. By disregarding a lot of problems concerning the reading of a musical score as a complex process of interpretation, let's say that the musical score is a semiotic device which tells one how to produce a given sequence of sounds, and only after the transformation of a series of written signs into sounds, the listener can say that they are enjoying the Fifth Symphony. And this happens even to a very skilled musician able to read the score silently by, in fact, reproducing the sounds in his mind. When we say that it is true in this world that in a Tolstoy's novel it is written that Anna Karenina and so on, we simply say that it is true in this world that on a given printed page there is a sequence of written words by pronouncing which, even though only mentally, the reader will afterwards realize that there should be a narrative world where persons like Anna and Vronsky exist. But when speaking of Anna Karenina or Vronsky, we usually do not consider any longer the page where we read about their vicissitudes, but rather speak of them in the same way as they were persons. Do not forget that our problem is why we can be emotionally moved by the deeds of fictional characters. As I said, in spite of every logician, nobody is supposed to weep because Tolstoy wrote that. This is none of our business. So we don't weep for the fact that the Bible starts with Bereshit. We weep because Cain killed Abel and so on and so forth. The 99% of the world population doesn't know that the Bible starts with Bereshit. Okay. Nobody can reasonably deny that Hitler and Anna Karenina are two different kinds of entity with a different ontological status. Hitler physically existed and Anna didn't. In spite of this, we can say that not only fictional assertions, but also the historical ones are the dicto and not the re. The students who write that Hitler died in a bunker in Berlin simply states that this is true according to their history textbooks. They were not there to check. In other words, except judgments depending on my direct experience of the kind today is raining, all the judgments I can make on the grounds of my cultural experience, that is, all those concerning the information recorded by an encyclopedia, are based on textual information, and even though they seem to express de facto truth, they are merely the dictum. Encyclopedic assertions are, however, still open to revision. If we keep a scientific mind, we must be ready to revise our opinions about Hitler's death whenever new documents will be discovered. Moreover, the fact that Hitler died in a bunker has already been cast in doubt by some historians. On the contrary, the assertion Anna Karenina commits suicide cannot be cast in doubt. Notice that what I have just said holds for Anna Karenina, Hamlet, and many others, but not for every fictional characters. There is a lot of interesting narrative characters who have remained unknown to the great majority of readers and stand, so to speak, prisoner of their original score. On the contrary, I have recently read that according to a reliable test, many Britons believe that Sherlock Holmes and Eleanor Rigby really existed. And some readers believed that Winston Churchill was a fictional character. It should be after the Bologna system application. Hamlet or Sherlock Holmes got a sort of existence independent of their original scores. Many fictional characters live outside the score which has given them existence and move to a zone of the universe which we find very difficult to delimit. Some of them even migrate from text to text because the collective imagination has, over the course of the centuries, made emotional investments in them and has transformed them into fluctuating entities. That's why exists a story like Pinocchio Sportsman on the Song of D'Artagnan and things like that. The characters are fluctuating in different texts. It is not indispensable that they came from great works of art or from popular legends. In this sense, we have appointed as fluctuating entities both Hamlet and Robin Hood, Heathcliff and Milady, Leopold Bloom and Mickey Mouse. To become a fluctuating entity doesn't depend on the aesthetic qualities of the original score. Why so many people suffer for the suicide of Anna Karenina and only a small bunch of Victor Hugo's addicts sympathize with the suicide of Simurdin in 1993. Personally, I feel more touching the fate of Simurdin, a gigantic hero, than the one of the poor lady. Too bad. The majority is against me. On the contrary, Dido or Medea, Don Quixote, Madame Bovary, Holden Caulfield, Gatsby, Philip Marlowe, Maigret, or Hercule Poirot became individuals living outside their original scores, and even those who have never read the original texts can claim to make true statements about them. Being independent of the text and of the possible world where they were born, they are, so to speak, circulating among us, and we prove some difficulties in not considering them as a real person. The original text is so irrelevant that everybody, even in this room, I bet, is ready to swear that Sherlock Holmes always said, "Elementary, my dear Watson." Elementary, my dear Watson never recurs in the works of Arthur Conan Doyle. It is a fluctuating assertion. Let's define better the epistemological status of these entities. A fluctuating character exhibits a core of properties that seems to be identified by everybody. For instance, Little Red Riding Hood is a girl, she wore a red cap, she met a wolf who later devoured her and her grandmother, even though different people can have different ideas about the age of the girl, the kind of food she had in her basket, and so on and so forth. It has been suggested that a fictional character is an object called of a higher order, that is, one of these objects that are something more than the sum of their properties. What is crucial for the recognition of the object is that it maintains a sort of gestalt, a constant relation between its elements, even if these elements are no longer the same. The most trivial example of a higher order object is the train Tallinn-Tartu of 425. It will be always the same, even if you change the cars and you change everything. A typical example of higher order object is a melody. Chopin Piano Sonata No. 2 in B flat minor, opus 35, will remain melodically recognizable even if played by a mandolin. From an aesthetic point of view, the result will be disastrous, but the melodic pattern would be preserved, and it would be recognizable also if some notes would be dropped. It would be interesting to decide which notes can be dropped without destroying the musical gestalt, and which ones are, on the contrary, essential or diagnostic in order to identify that melody as such. It is not a theoretical problem, it is rather a task for a musical critic, and it will have different solutions according to the object under analysis. This reflection is, however, important because the same problem exists when we are dealing with fictional characters. There are two versions of Little Red Riding Hood story, the Perrault's and the Grimm's one. And in the first, the girl is not rescued by the hunters. She remains in the belly of the wolf, is more moralistic. Curiously enough, the girl remains the same individual in both versions. So it's curious that the fact of being rescued by the hunter is not diagnostic for Little Red Riding Hood. On the contrary, to be swallowed by the wolf with the grandmother, it is. While I suspect nobody would recognize Little Red Riding Hood if she appeared as a young lady dressed like a princess and without a red cap. Would Madame Bovary still be Madame Bovary if she didn't commit suicide? This is a short story by Woody Allen's The Kugelmass episode in Side Effects, where Madame Bovary, by a sort of time machine, is brought to have a love affair in today's New York. She goes to Tiffany and things like that. Emma Bovary appears as a parody of the real one. She wears contemporary dresses and, as I said, behaves as a Tiffany goer. But she's still recognizable because she keeps most of her basic properties. Namely, she's a petit bourgeois, the wife of a doctor. She lives usually at Yonville. She's unsatisfied of her countryside life. She's inclined to adultery, and in fact she has a love affair with Kugelmass. In Allen's story, the suicide is not mentioned, but it is essential for the ironic quality of the narration in order Emma to be fascinating and desirable. And in fact, Kugelmass is obliged to science-fictionally enter Flaubert's world before Madame Bovary had her last adulterous relation, just in order not to arrive too late, but before the suicide, which is in any way in the background as a very well-known property of the lady. We can thus assume that a fictional character remains the same even if it is set in a different context, provided diagnostic properties to be defined for each case are preserved. Anna Karenina was, if I remember rightly, a countess, but she could have been a baroness, or it wouldn't change. At this point, I cannot escape at least one basic ontological question. Which kind of entities are fictional characters, and in which way they, if do not exist, at least subsist? I say that a fictional character is a semiotic object. I define so every set of properties recorded by the Encyclopedia of a Culture, conveyed by an expression, a word, an image, or some other device, provided one assumes that every expression is, as Searle has suggested, a peg for hanging descriptions of properties. From my point of you. The happy few have realized that I am definitely against the Kripke's theory of rigid designation. From my point of view, these pegs are not only proper names, but every expression which conveys as its proper content whatever we are used to call the meaning or the signified of the expression, the idea of an animal, of a place, of a thing, of a feeling, of an action, of a natural law like universal gravitation, of a mathematical entity, etc. Thus, the expression dog conveys as its content the properties of being an animal, a mammal, a canid, a barking creature, the man's best friend, and many other properties registered by a comprehensive encyclopedia. The properties can, in their turn, be interpreted by other expressions, and the series of these interrelated interpretations constitutes the whole of the notions shared by a community, socially and collectively recorded. There are many kinds of semiotics objects, some of them representing physically existing objects or classes of physically existing objects, like the ones conveyed by such terms as horse or flower, and more or less corresponding to the classical universals like the Platonic horseness. There are other semiotic objects representing abstract notions or ideal objects, like freedom, justice, or square rules, and others that have been labeled social objects, among which marriages, money, diplomas, in general every entity which has the nature of a law established by a collective agreement. But there are also semiotic objects representing human or humanized individuals. I said that I don't share the theory of rigid designation, and I believe that the proper name Napoleon conveys the properties, is not a sort of index directed toward a given piece of the world of furniture, but simply conveys, or is a peg for hanging, the properties of being born in Ajaccio, to have been a French general, to have become an emperor, to have won at Austerlitz, to have died in St. Helena on May 5, 1821, and so on. And the same holds for the proper name Barack Obama. Among the bearer of a proper name, the great majority has the property of existing, of to have physically existed in some spatio-temporal location. That's why, among the properties of Napoleon, there are, usually into brackets, the information that is born that year and he died that year, so we know that he existed and no longer exists. Notwithstanding, there are proper names conveying the properties of individuals characterized by the feature of being fictive, and as such they are usually registered by a good encyclopedia. A good encyclopedia, say Napoleon, French general, born Pantagruel, a fictive character invented by Rabelais, and so on, without the date, born or dead. The existence of fictional characters obliges semiotics to revise some of its approaches that risk to look excessively simplified. The classical semantic triangle, and I didn't use PowerPoint or a blackboard because it's so easy to remember it. The classical semantic triangle usually appears this way. At the lower left side there is the signifier, or the sign, or the expression. At the top, the signified, or the meaning, or the content. At the right lower side, the referent. That is the given existing object corresponding to the expression. This is a very naive way of representing the processes of signification and communication. For instance, the insertion of the referent in this triangle is due to the fact that frequently We use expressions in order to indicate something physically existing in our world. So happens when we speak of my friend John of Tartu on that microphone, of the fact that outside it's raining, or that in the kitchen there is my dog Tom trying to open the refrigerator. I follow Strawson in assuming that mentioning or referring is not something an expression does, but rather something that someone can use an expression to do. Mentioning or referring are functions of the use of an expression, not a property of the expression. I do not believe that we are implementing acts of reference when we say that dogs are animals or that cats are nice. In these cases, we are still making judgments about a given semiotic object, a class, predicating of it some of its properties. A scientist can say to have discovered a new property of apples, and she implements an act of reference when she says or writes in her protocols that she tested those properties of apples on the real individual apples mentioned in the protocols. So, referring to a series of real objects she used to perform her experiments to legitimate her induction. But as soon as her discovery is accepted by the scientific community, the new property is predicated of apples in general. It will be permanently part of the content of the word apple. We implement acts of reference when we speak of individuals, but there is a difference between referring to existing individuals and mentioning individuals who existed in the past. In the content of the expression Napoleon, it should be registered, as I said, that he died on May 5, 1821. On the contrary, among the properties of the content of the expression Obama, there must be one of being alive and President of the United States. If I say that Obama is today in Baghdad, I invite my addressees to verify my assertion, if they want, or by using prostheses as newspaper, TV, journals, and so on, in a precise spatio-temporal location of the physical existing world. On the contrary, who says P of Napoleon is not inviting people to verify P in the past world. Except one has a time machine, one cannot go back in the past to check if Napoleon really won at Austerlitz. Every assertion about Napoleon either says which are the properties conveyed by the expression Napoleon, or concerns and refers to a newfound document that changes what we believe until now about him. For instance, that he didn't die on May 5, but on May 6, let's say. Only when the scientific community has checked that document as a physically existing object, we can proceed to the correction of the encyclopedia, that is, of the properties attributed to Napoleon as a semiotic object. It can happen that Napoleon becomes the main character of a biographical reconstruction, not to speak of a historical novel, that tries to make him to live again in his time, reconstructing his action and even his feelings. In this case, Napoleon becomes very similar to a fictional character. We know that he really existed, but in order to take part in his life, we try to imagine his past world as it were the possible world of a novel. What happens, in fact, with fictional characters? It is true that some of them are introduced as somebody who lived once upon a time, like Little Red Riding Hood and Anna Karenina. But we have ascertained that by virtue of a narrative agreement, the reader is bound to take for true what is narrated and to pretend to live in the possible world of the narration as it were his or her real one. At this point, it's irrelevant whether the story speaks about an allegedly living person, like a given detective presently acting in Los Angeles, or about an allegedly dead person. It is like in this world somebody tells us that one of our relatives is just dead. Even if he or she died, we take it as an event happening just now in our world. Even though Roger Bacon said that if the name John refers to somebody who died 5 seconds ago, he has lost any meaning, but this concerned Roger Bacon. Thus, if we have to propose a semantic triangle for the fictional objects, we should put on the corner of the referent not a thing, but the whole Tolstoy's possible world, where we pretend that there are individuals and events in a given spatial-temporal situation, location. When speaking of Anna Karenina, one implements a virtual reference to the inhabitants of a possible fictional world as if they were real persons. I said that we are shocked by a daydream where our beloved dies, but at the end of our reverie, we come back to our everyday life and we recognize that we had no real reason to worry. What happens with fictional characters? To be permanently, sentimentally involved with the inhabitants of a fictional possible world, we must then satisfy two requirements. We must live in the fictional possible world as in an uninterrupted daydream. And we must in some way behave as if we were one of its characters. It can thus happen that when we enter a very absorbing and captivating possible narrative world, a textual strategy can provoke something similar to a mystic raptus or to a hallucination, and we simply forget to have entered an only possible world. It happens especially when we meet a character in its original score of a new enticing context. But since these characters are fluctuating and, so to speak, they come and go in our mind, and they are permanently present in our discourse, we, like we say, for instance, of a jealous person that he is an Otellus, or of a penny pincher that he is a Scrooge, they are always ready to mesmerize us and to make us to believe that they are among us. As for the second requirements, once we live in a possible world as if was our real one, we can be disturbed by the fact that in that world we are not, so to speak, formally registered. In that world we are not existing. And we are pulled to assume the personality of somebody else who has the right to live in there, and we can identify ourselves with one of the fictional characters. However, when awaking from a daydream in which our beloved dies, we recognize that what we imagined was false, and we take for true the assertion, "My beloved is still well and alive," maybe in Mexico City, as they say. On the contrary, when the fictional hallucination stops, simply because le vent se lève, il faut tenter de vivre, we continue to take for true that Anna Karenina committed suicide, Oedipus killed his father, and Sherlock Holmes lives or lived in Baker Street. It happens that, being fluctuating entities, these faithful companions of our life, unlike all the other semiotic objects, which are cultural subjects to revision, and perhaps only similar to mathematical entities, but nobody weeps for the fact that right angles has 90 degrees, and it is because of the incorrigibility of their deeds that we can dare to say that it is true that they were or did so and so, since we cannot change their fate. Is there somebody else who shares the same fate? Yes. They are the heroes and divinities of every mythology and many other legendary beings, like unicorns, dwarves, fairies, and Santa Claus, as well as the 90% of the entities of the various religions. It is obvious that for an atheist, every religious entity is a fictional one, while for a believer there is somewhere a spiritual or world of supernatural objects like gods, angels, and so on, inaccessible to our senses, but absolutely real. And in this sense, an atheist and a believer rely on two different ontologies. But if a Roman Catholic recognizes as really existing a personal God and assume that from him and from his Son the Holy Ghost proceeds, then they must consider Allah, Shiva, or the Great Spirit of the prairies as mere fictions, obviously, designed by a sacred narration. Likewise, for a Buddhist, the God of the Bible is a mere fictional individual. And the fictional individual is Gitchi Manitou for a Muslim as well as for a Christian. This means that for a believer in whatever confession, all the religious entities of the other religions, that is an overwhelming majority of entities, are fictional individuals. So that we are entitled to consider more or less the 90% of religious entity as fictions. The only debatable point is which one is the real one, and we are free to make our choice. One could object that at least for the believer in religion X, their divinity really exists, while for all the fans of Alice, she is a non-physically existing object. But if we were going to test the true beliefs of common people, we would discover that many Christians are not sure that Jesus really resurrected. Others go to the Mass but are very doubtful about the real existence of the Holy Ghost. Others sincerely believe in God but think that Jesus was only a very virtuous human being. And finally, many Catholics still consider a certain saints as persons who really exist, while the Roman Church has officially declared that they were legends. Conversely, we have seen that some Britons believe that Holmes was a real person. Many Christian poets started their works by invoking the Muses or Apollo, and we do not exactly understand if they simply use a literary topos or were in some way taking seriously the divinities of the Olympus. Many mythological characters have become protagonists of narrations, and in a symmetrical way, many protagonists of secular narrations have become very similar to the characters of mythological tales, so that mythical heroes and gods, literary characters and religious entities are frequently separated by imprecise borderlines. We have said that unlike all the other semiotic objects which are cultural subject to revision, and perhaps only similar to mathematical entities, fictional characters will never change and will remain the actors of what they did once and forever. And it is because of the incorrigibility of their deeds that we can dare to say that it is true that they were or did so and so. That is why they are important for us, even from, let's say, a moral point of view. Justin, we are watching Oedipus Rex, and we yearn that this fellow took any other road instead of the one where he met and murdered his father, and wonder why he reached Thebes and not, let's say, Athens, when he could have married Phryne or Aspasia. We read Hamlet asking why such a nice boy could not marry Ophelia and live with her happily, having killed that scoundrel of his uncle and gently kicked out of Denmark his mother. Why Heathcliff, did not tolerate a little more his humiliation, wanting until he could marry Catherine and living with her as a respected country gentleman? Why Prince Andrei could not recover from his mortal illness and marry Natasha? Why Raskolnikov had the morbid idea of killing an old lady instead of finishing his studies and becoming a respected professional? Why, when Gregor Samsa was transformed into a horrible bug, a beautiful princess did not arrive kissing him and transforming him into the most handsome young man in Prague? Why, on the arid hills of Spain, Robert Jordan could not beat those fascist pigs and join again his sweet Maria? Now, in principle, we can. It's now enough to buy a computer program for rewriting Oedipus, Wuthering Heights, War and Peace, Crime and Punishment, The Metamorphosis, For Whom the Bell Tolls. But do we really want to do so? The devastating experience of discovering that in spite of our wishes, Hamlet, Robert Jordan, or Prince Andrei died. That things happened in that way and forever, no matter what we wanted, hoped, or yearned during the course of our reading, makes us to feel the shiver of destiny. We realize that we cannot decide whether Ahab will capture the whale or not. The real lesson of Moby Dick is that the whale goes wherever she wants. The charm of the great tragedies comes from the fact that their heroes, instead of escaping an atrocious fate, plunge into the abyss that they have dug with their own hands, because they do not know what expects them, and we, who see clearly where they are blindly going, we cannot stop them. We have a cognitive access to the world of Oedipus, and we know everything about him and Jocasta, but they, even if living in a parasitical world which depends on our own, do not know anything about us. A fictional character cannot communicate with his or her counterpart in the actual world. Such a problem is not as whimsical as it seems. Please try to take it seriously. Oedipus cannot conceive of the world of Sophocles. Otherwise, he would have not married his mother. Fictional characters live in an incomplete, or to be more rude and politically incorrect, handicapped world. But when we really understand their fate, then we start to suspect that we too, as citizens of the actual world, frequently undergo our destiny just because we think of our world in the same way as the fictional characters think of their own. Fiction suggests that perhaps our view of the actual world is as much imperfect as the one of fictional characters. This is why successful fictional characters become paramount examples of the real human condition. Thank you.